Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. Do you identify as a late bloomer? I do. If you don't, it's not too late to grow later in life. This week I speak to the author of a book on late blooming. One of the major themes in the episode is that being solo allows you time, energy, and financial resources to grow. The author talks about how you may need to, quote-unquote, repot yourself somewhere different. And he presents 6 characteristics of late bloomers. And bonus material is back. If you stick to the end, my guest presents some notable late bloomers. In that vein, I'm going to read you part of a passage from George Lois's book, Damn Good Advice for People with Talent. He's the guy that allegedly Don Draper is based on in the show Mad Men. Here's lesson number 102. If you're reading this and you're approaching 50 years of age, remember that oak trees do not produce acorns until they are 50 years old. Charles Darwin was 50 when he wrote On the Origin of Species. At 52, Ray Kroc, a milkshake machine salesman, turned McDonald's from a small chain of restaurants into a humongous fast food empire. Dr. Ruth Westheimer became famous for her straight talk about sex when she was 52. Julia Child was just shy of 50 when she wrote her first cookbook. So I hope that provides you a little bit of inspiration. I hope you enjoy this episode. It's a good one. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Rich Karlgaard. Rich is a 28-year veteran at Forbes, a speaker, and author of 4 books: Team Genius, The Soft Edge, Life 2.0, and what we're primarily going to discuss today, Late Bloomers, The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement. Welcome, Rich.
Thanks for having me on your show, Peter.
Yeah, it's great. So I found your book in a used bookstore in the Yucca Valley where I was shopping illegally because it was during the pandemic, and Joe, the 72-year-old owner of this bookstore, was opening from 10 a.m. to noon, like Tuesday through Friday. And if you had a mask, you could go in there. And I was just the books are $2, $3, $4. I'm sure yours was the $4, was one of the expensive ones. But, and I just was grabbing stuff, cause at that price, it's worth it to just roll the dice on a book. And I saw yours, and I am a self-identified late bloomer. And so I grabbed it, read it, and then emailed you, and you were kind enough to say yes to this. So thank you. I think the way we should start is I want you to define what is a late bloomer, and then tell me how you decided to write this book. And then I will say why I think it's relevant to solo.
Sure. Well, I was an outsider when I decided to write this book, in the sense that I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a neuroscientist for sure. And I'm a business writer. And I live in Silicon Valley, even though Forbes is headquartered in New York. So I've spent my career really looking at the intersection of technology and business and finance. So for me to write Late Bloomers meant that I had to really do a lot of work, reading background literature, learning as much as I could about psychology and about neuroscience, the brain, and the psychology of blooming later than expected. And so I was surprised that there was no really good definition of late bloomer out there. And in fact, when it would make a rare appearance in the scientific literature, it was always a pejorative.
Oh, interesting.
And so I decided to come up with my own definition of what it means to be a late bloomer, and that is somebody who comes into their full capacities and motivations and sense of purpose later than expected. Simply that, later than expected. And it can be very contextual. For instance, the quarterback Tom Brady won his first Super Bowl at age 24. You would say that he's an early bloomer. But hold the phone. Tom Brady only started 1 year of college at the University of Michigan, only started 1 year as a quarterback. And he was drafted in the 6th round of the NFL draft. 198 players were taken before Brady. So in the context of football, he was sort of a late bloomer, even though he won a Super Bowl at 24, because he came into his full capacities later than people expect you to in that field. So it's very contextual. A software coder who blossoms in their 30s would be a late bloomer. A philosopher or an historian who writes great history books or great books of philosophy in their 30s would be an early bloomer.
I see. Yes.
Because it's contextual to the field. But I really want to get back to this. It's that intersection where your full capacities, your sense of purpose, and your motivation get lit up. You know, a bulb switches on, a light bulb switches on. Mm-hmm. And I wrote the book because I identify as a late bloomer also, as I write about in the book, from around beginning of adolescence through my late 20s. I had the sense that I wasn't blossoming very much, even though with a couple of exceptions. I was reasonably good runner in track and field, good enough to qualify for the state meet, good enough to run in the fast heat of the mile, but pretty much that's the best I got. And I went to Stanford. You'd say somebody who got into Stanford is an early bloomer, but if you look at the route by which I got in and how much easier it was to get in back in the day when I got in, it wasn't the accomplishment it is today. But the point is that my roommates at Stanford were off doing extraordinary things at age 25, beginning legal careers, another one had just finished his master's program and was working on the space shuttle program, working on the heat tiles. Another was getting his doctorate in clinical psychology. And I was doing none of those. In fact, I could hold a job of no greater responsibility at age 25 than dishwasher and security guard. And it really hit home one night when I was a security guard. And I read about this in Late Bloomers, where I was a security guard at a trucking yard in San Jose. And I was making my rounds in my security guard's uniform and, having to key these places along the perimeter fence to show that I'd made my rounds. And I heard barking across the way, and I swung my flashlight around. And there was a very angry-looking dog, a Doberman or some kind of a dog like that was, if not for the chain-link fence separating us, would have torn me apart. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me after my adrenaline started subsiding that on the other side of that chain-link fence was another trucking yard, and that other trucking yard's concept of a security guard was a dog.
Yes.
And
so you're competing with the dog for your job.
My professional colleague at age 25 was a dog.
Right.
So
I remember that story.
Qualifies me as a late bloomer. And I have the sense that my brain, the logical side of my brain, the ability to plan ahead and think ahead, all of that stuff that really defines us as fully functioning adults didn't even begin to happen until I was age 26 or 27.
Mm-hmm. So I think that one of the things that you highlight that I liked a lot is so if I want to just make sure I have your definition right. So you talk about capacity, motivation, and what is the third element of a late bloomer?
Sense of purpose.
Sense of purpose.
Yes. I don't like the word passion so much because I think you can feel passionate about a restaurant that you just ate or a movie you just watched. Mm-hmm. Passion, as we use it in popular culture, is not as deep as sense of purpose is. A sense of purpose, the fact is the feeling that you're being well used and coming into your full capacities that, okay, this is what I really do. Mm-hmm. Scott Adams the cartoonist and writer, talks about his, building blocks of things. He came into his full capacities using building blocks of things that he was pretty good at. And when you added up all the things that he was pretty good at, you got to the point where he was uniquely good at what he did.
Yeah, he calls it his skill stack. He's a great late bloomer story, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think without the late bloomer perspective, he couldn't have come up with a cubicle rat character like Dilbert.
Yes. And we're going to return. We're going to do a little bonus material. I'm going to dust off the bonus material here, and we're going to talk about a few famous late bloomers at the end here. So I like that idea about later than expected. And what's interesting is the expectations are skewed young because that's a newsworthy story, right? We pay attention to the prodigies, the 30 under 30, the 40 under 40. That makes good news. It makes good clickbait headlines. It's fun to think about Mark Zuckerberg inventing Facebook as a college student. I remember reading a TechCrunch article that did an analysis of successful founders and found that the solo 20-year-old, 20-something founder is outside the norm. They're more likely to be folks in their 30s, a pair, folks who've had businesses previously. That's not a sexy story. And yet those people are the ones who are often reaching capacity, have the motivation and sense of purpose.
Since you mentioned TechCrunch, one of the things I've been able to observe is that younger people what they're really good at as entrepreneurs in the tech space is that they understand that they feel emerging trends in their fingertips, and they're really good at consumer technology. Mm-hmm. And so you look at, some of the iconic companies that were founded with founders in their 20s, from Apple to Microsoft to Google to Facebook. They all had those in common, and they were rapid scale companies. Apple a little less so because it's hard to scale hardware. It's easy to scale software, and particularly today, it's easier to scale. Yes. But when you look at enterprise technology, the Microsoft that Bill Gates and Paul Allen created is not the Microsoft enterprise giant that it is today.
Yeah, or Salesforce or these big companies.
Yeah. And I just did an interview yesterday with Bill McDermott, the CEO of ServiceNow.
Okay.
And ServiceNow was founded by a guy named Fred Luddy, who's the chairman of the board. And Fred Luddy founded ServiceNow a day before his 50th birthday. And ServiceNow's got a $75 billion market cap. And by the way, McDermott, is 58 or 59. When you look at enterprise software, enterprise tech, you don't find the young people as much at the top, because enterprise tech, it's a different kind of more mature sales cycle. It's not a hot fashion. And so even though I think Silicon Valley and Seattle have this image that it's only the young entrepreneurs that are getting things done, it's not true. It may be for a variety of reasons, because some of the biggest successes have been founded by people in their 20s. And as you say, it's a sexier story.
Indeed. Yeah. And so for listeners who aren't familiar with this term enterprise, this is like a lot of what we call B2B, business to business.
Exactly.
So software as a service. This is when a company, you may sign up for Spotify, it costs you $10 a month, but you sign up for Salesforce for your company, it costs you millions of dollars, right? Like that's the difference between these kinds of, and it probably helps to have experience working in business before you try to build enterprise software.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's one myth you could debunk. I think that Carl Schramm, who used to have the Kaufman Foundation, the largest philanthropic foundation in the United States that studies entrepreneurship, says the average age of an entrepreneur in the U.S. is 47.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, and also I think it just takes sometimes reps. So to go back to Scott Adams for a moment, one of the things that Scott argues, and then also I'm sure you're familiar with this Silicon Valley character named Naval. So Naval is known as the angel investor, and he's turned into a bit of a philosopher these days. Talks about if you've developed skills and you keep trying to create businesses, eventually something is going to go your way. given that you're going to be building, as Adams calls the skill stack, right? That you become a good coder, you become a good salesperson. You don't have to become elite in any of those things, but being in the 75th percentile in 3 or 4 things then leads you to be elite in a area.
Yes. And one of the great things about late blooming entrepreneurs is that they become people they didn't think they were capable of becoming. A lot of what stops people from trying their hand at entrepreneurship is a fear of sales. They're introverted, or they maybe had a bad experience with salespeople and have a mistaken idea of what salespeople actually do, or they may have been a failed salesperson because they simply didn't care that much for the product that they were selling. Another one that stops people is they don't know how to keep books, they don't know how to do accounting, and they think that it'd be impossible to be in business if you didn't know those things. Well, what you find out is, and this is why it's so important to try to find a way to arrive at that intersection of your skills, whether it's one really deep skill or it's a skill stack, as we've been talking about, but where you really feel like the thing you were meant to do is you have the capacities to do it, that you have a sense of purpose about what you do, and you have this motivation that gets lit up. And when you have a sense of purpose of what you're doing and you have a motivation that gets lit up, people can start selling. And people are able to leapfrog over the accounting problem and realize that they can hire accountants.
Yes, right.
And they realize that they need to keep booting themselves to a higher level of functionality at their own company and get good people to do the silo things. So it's I think we're going to go through a great experiment here because of COVID. I think we're going to see more entrepreneurship simply because we have to.
Yes.
I mean, people are going to become entrepreneurs because they have to. The 1970s wasn't a particularly good economic decade. It was certainly better than the 1930s, but it was a below average economic decade. You had gasoline prices quadrupling. You had the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States resigning in disgrace. You had a 45% drop, peak to trough in the stock market. You had the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, toward the end of the decade, talked about melees in the economy. And yet entrepreneurs came forward and the following companies were created in that decade: Apple, Microsoft, FedEx, Oracle, Charles Schwab. I mean, an amazing set of companies. So I think, I hope that we see the same thing today. I think maybe one of the most critical things that could happen, that needs to happen in the country, is for people to teach people how to be entrepreneurs and give them a helping hand, showing them how they can do it, particularly if they're from disadvantaged cultures or they come from disadvantaged communities and they may be too intimidated to think that they can do that.
Yeah, I think that's great.
And amongst all of that, there are going to be late bloomers because a whole heck of a lot of people in their mid 30s and 40s and 50s will have lost their source of income, or will have even lost their business if they had a restaurant or something like that, and will have to, they're not going to be the first person in HR at a big company is going to look to hire, right?
Indeed. Yes, that's right. This, I think you write about this in the book, this idea of having a growth mindset and how important that is for late blooming, because you have to believe that you're not born this way, that you can acquire new skills. And I think that one of the things I wrote about in my book, Stick to Business, is, these sort of stand-up comedian types fall into one of two categories. But you need both skills to be successful. You might be a kind of Dave Chappelle, natural performer, at ease on stage, and kind of quick-witted. Or you might be more of a Jerry Seinfeld, more of a joke writer, who puts pen to paper every day. But it's not the most charismatic force on stage. Obviously, both of those people need to learn to develop the other skill, which is either writing jokes or becoming a better performer. And in order to do that, you have to believe that you can become a better writer, or you have to believe that you can become a better performer. And I think that's a really critical element to continue to work on developing the capacity. And it seems like it'll give you the motivation to move towards these skills and accomplishments.
I'm always amazed, speaking of comedians, by the career of George Carlin, because if you look at George Carlin from, let's say, an Ed Sullivan clip, in the 1960s, you almost cringe for the guy. I mean,
Yes.
He's just passably good enough to have gotten on the Sullivan Show. And that's no mean accomplishment. It was no mean accomplishment, but he's just telling these kind of predictable canned jokes. And then some years after that, he just completely found himself.
Yes.
Found himself a changed person and let it rip. And only
Yes.
when he started letting it rip. This growth mindset, I have to give a tip of the hat to Carol Dweck.
Indeed.
Carol Dweck wrote the book Mindset, and I interviewed her. And she said something that was really worrisome for me. If you go look at my book, Late Bloomers, and you can buy it on Amazon as well as shadow bookstores open 2 hours a day. I just want to remind you, it's actually coming out in paperback this
Excellent.
fall. But the first third of the book is really kind of a scathing manifesto against the early blooming pressures that we put on kids and young adults today. And Carol Dweck, who wrote the book Mindset, gave me an extraordinary insight. She said the kids that she sees today at Stanford are brittle and broken and exhausted, and they don't want to take chances. So think about the perversity of that, of doing everything it takes to get into an elite university that kids have to do today. They have to get practically near 800 math essay, or 800 on, the various portions of their SAT. They have to have, 4.3 grade averages in advanced placement courses and probably stand out in some extracurricular like sports. And then maybe they have a chance of getting into an elite school. And Carol Dweck says that the downside of that is that kids don't want to try anything. They're, in her words, they're so afraid of marring their perfect records. And so this is a bad outcome. This is not the outcome that all of these early blooming pressures that we're putting on kids and young adults is supposed to accomplish.
Right.
And it was not supposed to lead to higher rates of anxiety and depression and suicide either. And yet it has.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Hannah Rosen of the Atlantic Monthly wrote a cover story in 2015 called The Silicon Valley Suicides, about a wave of suicides in high schools in Palo Alto, California. And what struck her is that these kids didn't fit the normal profile of kids who take their own lives. That is to say, they weren't people with long bout of clinical depression, or kids who were mucking around with guns or hanging out with the wrong people. There were simply kids who couldn't handle the pressure. One of the kids that took his own life had left. His last post on social media was that he was tired of getting up at 4:30 in the morning to keep up with his advanced placement classes. He felt like a loser because he was a B+ student.
Yeah, it's really brutal. I think one of the ideas that I've fussed around with, I don't know what to do with it yet because I don't think it's an overarching kind of rule, but this idea that when people feel like they don't have a plan B, so comics have this a lot. They're like, I was either going to succeed or die. Like that they had to take risks because they didn't know anything else to do. They had nothing to fall back on. And so when you have a Stanford degree to fall back on, you have this very safe path, right? Which is, get good enough grades at Stanford, then go on the job market, get a cushy, job in corporate America, not cushy, but, get a job in corporate America, climb the corporate ladder, make good money, afford that Bay Area house, et cetera, et cetera. The problem, of course, with that is so creativity stifling that it really doesn't give someone a chance to create that sense of purpose or build some kind of world-changing capacity that I think
you're absolutely right. If you go to your fifth year anniversary, your college class, who are the people that stand out? Well, they're the people who just got through law school and they just got a job at at a big time law firm. And probably the earliest blooming among my roommates in college was that kind of a person. And he joined what became the top law firm in Silicon Valley, and he made a lot of money, and he had a good career. But I sensed this unhappiness about him. I saw his natural humor and the lightness in him begin to fade away.
Lawyering will do that to you.
Yeah, over the course of his career. And at one time, I guess when he was in more confessional mode, he said, he confessed that he felt like a highly paid concierge service for the people who were really going out and doing cool things, which was building companies.
Yes.
And he said, I said, well, you could do that. And he says, I can't. And I said, why not? He said, the opportunity costs.
Yes, right. He's sunk all those costs.
Yeah.
So can I ask?
He later found an accommodation, and his accommodation was to step away from working with large, being a lawyer for the large companies. And he carved out this kind of venture law practice within his law firm where he would work with startup entrepreneurs and discount his fees and take some shares.
I see.
So he finally figured out a way to do that and re-blossomed, repotted himself into a different sort of legal career.
Blooming late.
Yeah.
He bloomed early and then late.
Bloomed early, and then he faded into an unhappy 30s and 40s, ugly divorce, all kinds of things like that. And then he finally repotted himself and bloomed again.
I see. So we've covered so far sort of three areas that people can bloom late in. So we talked about art. So in the terms of comedy, obviously this happens actually in four places. So it can happen in sort of art. You can imagine comedy, music, etc. Business, entrepreneurship that we've talked about, academia, so this happens sometimes. Like there's research on the median age of scientists when they do their discoveries. And so there are different numbers for math or philosophy or psychology or whatever it is. And then, sports, right? So athletic achievements, right? So this happens a lot, right? So someone comes into a league, a second round draft pick, and then ends up becoming a Hall of Fame, basketball player or something.
Yeah, or look at Andy Reid, the coach of the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yes, that's right.
Won his first Super Bowl, and no spring chicken there. And he, if you recall that game against the San Francisco 49ers, and I have to say that we who live in the San Francisco Bay Area we'll never forget it, because we saw the collapse of the 49ers against the Chiefs in the last 8 minutes of the game. They were firmly in control until they weren't. And San Francisco's head coach is a brilliant young man. I mean, he's got a career ahead of him. And Andy Reid was old enough to be his father or more.
The grizzled old veteran.
Grizzled old veteran. And
yes.
At the end of the day, the grizzled old veteran found a way to get, with obviously the best quarterback in the game, Patrick Mahomes, too, but they figured out a way to disrupt the 49ers momentum and get back in the game and pull a rabbit out of the hat and win. So at least, maybe not Patrick Mahomes, who's an early bloomer, but, and Andy Reid is a great inspirational late bloomer.
Yeah, it's great. So obviously this can happen in, intellectual, physical, creative, domains. So this can be rather broad. Part of the reason why, for a podcast called Solo, The Single Person's Guide to a Remarkable Life, there's two things going on here. One is this is, targeted to people who are, focused on autonomy in their life. And, so they may be partnered in some way. They may be dating. They don't, but they're not sort of walking a traditional path of marriage, children, the white picket fence and so on. And my argument is that these people have opportunity. That is, they have time. They may have energy. They may have resources that they can dedicate to things that the typical American doesn't, because they're living that traditional, raising family, settled and so on and so forth. And then I like the term remarkable because it suggests that they are doing something that's worth remarking on. That is, it's something that people talk about, think about, look at, and, that there's something elevated about what they're using this time and energy and resources for. And so, why talk about late bloomers? Well, I mean, my argument, and I'm curious what your reaction is to this, is that people who are solo, who are single, or who get divorced, for example, may have more opportunity to develop late. That they have a chance to work on those capacities, that they can focus their motivations, they can develop a sense of purpose outside of the ones that are sort of the obvious ones, like you were talking about your friend who's like, you go to law school, what do I do next? You get a job at a law firm, what do you do next? You get married, what do you do next? You have kids, what do you do next? You know what I mean? You retire, what do you do next? You die, right? That kind of path. And so I'm curious your reaction to that logic that I have, that there might be a special opportunity for my solo listeners to develop later than they might think that they could have or should have.
I've got a chapter in the book on this concept of repotting. And I think it's so important if you want to bloom, if you want that feeling that you're at the intersection where you were meant to be. That is the intersection in life where your full complement of talents, your full motivational engagement, and your sense of purpose, your sense of mission is so deep that you feel literally lifted toward some destiny. And what prevents people from doing that? Part of it is our obsession with this early achievement. We see it at school, we see it in sports. I talked a little bit about that, and the first third of the book is kind of an angry manifesto about that. And the last half of the book is, well, now what do we do about it? In a culture that rewards and celebrates early bloomers, what should the late bloomers think about? Well, they have these capacities that keep getting better. Some things like your ability to do math really fast. That's going to be something you probably do really well in your 20s. High frequency traders, people are writing software code under time pressure. They tend to do those well. But our management skills, our empathetic skills, our wisdom skills, all of those are skills that keep growing as we go on. So that have faith in that. Have faith that we are constantly evolving and becoming new people. But then we also have to get ourselves into the environment where those things have a better chance to blossom. Mm-hmm. For instance, I grew up in a small city, Bismarck, North Dakota. And I sort of an introverted guy and a guy who liked to read a lot of books and things like that. I had a sense, it was really a valuable insight, but I had a sense that I was somebody who was meant to live in a college town or an urban area. And as a matter of fact, I live 5 miles from Stanford University. So, I live in the heart of Silicon Valley. It's a wonderful place to live, but I can thrive here in a way that I couldn't thrive. So location is really important. Your set of friends. Sometimes, we all have friends that aren't really the friends we think they are. They're just people who help us fill time, acquaintances. And among those kind of people, a certain percentage of them they don't really want to see you blossom because, it embarrasses them perhaps. They don't like the comparison. And then many people blossom after they get out of a bad relationship or a marriage, because they feel like they have been held down or they compromise the more, risk-taking part of their personalities, or they improperly channeled their risk-taking desires, in any way you can think of. And, so this idea that a lot of us have to repot. We have to repot with a new set of friends. We have to repot to a different locale. And we shouldn't be afraid to do that. And if suddenly you were in a relationship and suddenly you aren't, that's an opportunity to think about repotting in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I love that term. Obviously, the metaphor it works very nicely. So I identify as a late bloomer. I can point to many places in my life, athletically, for example, obviously academically, I can think about it. And what happens is once you've bloomed in some other area late, you recognize that you can transfer what you've learned about skill acquisition, about feedback, about hard work to those other areas. And that's, I think, one of the things is that you start to be able to build on this. I like this idea that you bring up about where you are may enhance your blooming. That's something I've written about in terms of, I call it saying taking a bigger stage, that going to a bigger place where you can be inspired by the people that you meet, the connections that you make. There's an energy there that you don't get in sort of small towns.
Peter, from where are you doing this podcast?
I'm in Los Angeles right now.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I saw the Colorado EDU, and I mentally pictured you as a Boulder guy.
I am. I have a full-time professor gig at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm on leave right now, and I'm living in Los Angeles in part for the reasons that you've discussed, because LA is, a great international city and a lot of opportunity.
But then you think if you're an endurance athlete, a cyclist or a runner or a triathlete, in a place like Boulder, you have a lot of support.
Yes.
And that's why it's become this natural center. In fact, around the U.S., around the world, you find these clusters.
Yes.
And you find your tribe. I think it's important to find your tribe.
Yes, I agree. Can I add one thing to this? So
Sure.
This came up in a previous episode. There's an episode called, Dating Friends and Sleeping with Strangers. And so I talked to a guy who that's his life philosophy. And we spent a lot of time talking about what makes a good friend. And one of the things was a good friend, so if I remember correctly, it's someone who is trustworthy, someone who is reliable, someone who's energizing. They make your life better. And then we talked about something that Jordan Peterson has talked about what a good friend will do is they will celebrate with you when good things happen, and they will commiserate with you when bad things happen, versus a bad friend who will feel threatened by your successes and not want to celebrate them, and will not really want to help you commiserate because they'll say, yeah, that's bad. That reminds me of the time when this other bad thing happened to me. And they're sort of outdoing you in that competitive way.
Steal the conversation. Yeah,
indeed.
I think he's absolutely right. It's just parenthetically, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of new Jordan Peterson we'll see after his healthcare crisis. I wish him nothing but the best. But
Indeed.
I think that's true, and particularly on both sides, the celebration and the commiseration. And you see, you have to be kind of alert to signs. People you think are friends, but they're a little snarky with you. They're always anything serious turns into irony. They're throwing up what they're due. They may be occasionally fun to hang around with and probably even more fun to party with, but what they're really doing is throwing a barrier up, and telling you I don't want to engage at that level. And that's fine. I think it's really helpful to see those people for who they are. They may be just fun acquaintances, and that's all.
Yeah. And of course, this extends to partners, right? So you were talking about people who get divorced, right? So they have a partner who has been holding them back. Who's not encouraging them to develop skills, is not encouraging them to take chances, and so on. And so that's why I thought this idea of solo living. I mean, it's not necessary nor sufficient, right? There are plenty of people who are enhanced and lifted up by their partners, but it's important to recognize what is your partner, if you have one, doing? Are they elevating you or are they holding you back?
Yep.
And, so one of the things that you present in the book, I'm going to read them and maybe we can comment on a few of them, as you put forth some strengths that late bloomers have, that if you possess these strengths, you are more likely to bloom, so to speak. So I'm just going to read them off and then we can talk about a few of them in the interest of time, because I want to get to our bonus material, famous late bloomers. So you have curiosity, compassion, resilience, insight, sort of creativity, perhaps, wisdom, and equanimity. Yes? Am I
Yes.
pronouncing that right? Can we start with the last one? Because I think that was a really fascinating one to me.
And that was
Equanimity. Yes.
Yeah. Equanimity is just a multisyllabic word, a $100 word that simply means you're able to stay calm under pressure.
Mm.
And I'll give you two recent examples of people who were stunningly good at staying calm under pressure. They both happen to be pilots.
Okay.
And one was Captain Sullenberger, who we know what he did. He landed the plane in the Hudson after a flock of birds took out the two engines, and he had to decide whether he could make it to Teterboro or Newark, and he knew as a glider pilot that he in his spare time that he couldn't do that, and he managed a safe landing on the Hudson and got everybody out. And when you listen to the tapes,
I have heard this. It's fascinating.
You're struck by how calm he is. And Sully was 57 when he pulled that off. And then the same thing happened with Tammy Jo Schultz, the Southwest Airlines pilot who was flying toward Philadelphia at 35,000 feet. One of the engines blew up. In fact, it shrapnel from the exploded engine went through a window and killed a woman. But she had to take the plane, so the cabin depressurized. She took the plane from 35,000 feet down to 10,000 feet. Stuff was flying around. People were screaming. People were vomiting. And she got the plane under control and she landed in Philadelphia without incident. The same thing. You listen to the air traffic control tapes and she's as calm could be. And it turns out that Tammy Jo Schultz, was in the military during the first Gulf War in the early 90s, and women couldn't be fighter pilots at that time, but they could be fighter pilot instructors. And so she was the best on the base, and she instructed these fighter pilots. But equanimity, the ability to stay calm under pressure, is something that we get. It's a gift that we get as we get older, and we should realize that and put that to good use. But my favorite one, I love curiosity, because curiosity is the bedrock of all blossoming and blooming. I mean, curiosity and the courage to follow our curiosity. And the reason why I think we're in trouble as a country with this obsession on early blooming is essentially we're asking kids and young adults to set aside their natural curiosity and replace it with a determined focus. So this is what Carol Dweck is talking about when she said these kids don't want to mar their perfect record. They don't know how to be curious. Yeah, they don't learn to disrespect their curiosity in favor of taking somebody else's test and acing it.
Yeah, that's right. It's the difference between what we call convergent thinking and divergent thinking. These guys get really good at convergent thinking, and yet the world in the long run rewards divergent thinking, which leads to creativity. Does. Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, I think people should read this book. And I think it's inspirational. And I think really the first step, as you approach this as a listener, is I would encourage you to think about and try to find the places in life where you bloomed late and use that as inspiration and motivation to focus on these other areas. We're going to wrap up right now, but we're going to return in a moment with some bonus material about some famous late bloomers. And I think people will get a kick out of who some of these are. So, Rich, I want to say I really appreciate your time. Thank you for writing such a good book, and one that I think is going to be inspirational for solo listeners. Cheers.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back for a little bit of bonus material. We're here still with Rich Karlgaard, and we're going to talk about a few famous late bloomers, a couple who came up in the previous conversation with Scott Adams and Tom Brady. Who else do you have, Rich? People might know or might not know who fit the description of late bloomer.
Well, the actor Morgan Freeman is a classic late bloomer. He toiled away on the stage. I believe he appeared in his first movie at age 53. And then once people got a look on him on the big screen and heard that iconic voice and that just wonderful, soulful person that he is career took off, he also learned to fly a plane and eventually piloted his own jet from Hollywood to this large plot of land that he has in northern Mississippi. So he bloomed. He not only bloomed in his professional career, he bloomed in his avocation, because his professional career success allowed him to become a pilot and eventually own and fly his own jet.
It helps to have millions of dollars if you want to become a pilot.
Yeah. I always thought airplanes flew on the Bernoulli principle, but they fly with money. It takes money to hoist an airplane in the air.
Hey, he's a great one. He's a great one. Yeah.
A person who's not perhaps known in popular culture, but is an iconic figure in Silicon Valley, where I live, is the entrepreneur Diane Green. Up until a year and a half ago, Diane Green was the CEO of Google Cloud at age 63, by the way. But Diane made her first big success with a company she founded with her husband called VMware.
Oh, yes.
Diane started VMware in her 40s. And she didn't even get her advanced degree in computer science until she was in her 30s. She had a passion for small sailboats and kiteboarding and things like that. She worked at Coleman Camper Company for much of her 20s. So she knocked around, kind of a classic, knocking around, trying different things, mainly in the recreational fields, and then decided around her mid-30s it's time to go back and get a degree, and she did. And then in her 40s, she created VMware. Well, VMware today is worth about $60 billion. It's still a great software company. There are a lot of people like that. Maybe, one of my favorites, I have to mention the football coach, Bill Walsh.
Okay.
Who coached the San Francisco 49ers to 3 Super Bowl wins in the 1980s. And he did not have his first head coaching job of any kind other than semi-pro football, which is just, played on lumpy fields and with bar bouncers, I guess.
Heavy on the semi, light on the professional.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did not have his first head coaching job of any kind until he was 47 years old.
I see.
But he allowed all of these things to percolate in his mind. And when he was head coach of the semi-professional team, the San Jose Apaches, he began to experiment with ideas that he couldn't have done if he had been in a professional football program at the time. It would have been considered too radical. And that was he imagined what a football offense would look like if it was run as if you were inbounding a basketball against a full court press. Because he had seen a high school practice the day before. He decided to do, and you do it with a bunch of pick and rolls, and you have a lot of people in motion, and you have to have the inbound, whoever's inbounding the ball has to be able to track his 4 teammates at the same time. So he said, what would it look like if I had a quarterback like that? And people forget that the quarterback that he drafted, Joe Montana, Montana was well known as a quarterback at Notre Dame, but Joe Montana almost pursued basketball. Instead, he had a full ride at North Carolina State under Jim Valvano. And the rap on Montana as a quarterback is he had a weak arm. But Walsh saw that he was a point guard. His arm was good enough, but the thing that he valued, Montana was able to, like a good point guard, see everybody on the court or the field. And that was the genesis of the West Coast offense, which still gets practiced in one form or another today.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, I like the fact that there's this sort of time, you have some time to experiment, the ability to take risks, the fact that you're pulling in some of these examples from other areas, that you can learn from other domains. And if you're too young, you haven't had enough experience widely to be able to do that.
And in fact, you're actively discouraged to do it.
Yes, that's
because
right.
Again, you're asked to trade your curiosity to look into adjacent fields and see, what could I borrow from this? What could I borrow from that? And acquire your skill stack, to use Scott Adams' wonderful terminology, to build your own skill stack as opposed to following the cookie cutter template that society is throwing at you.
Yeah, that's great. That's well said. Rich, I really appreciate your time. I really hope this inspires people to pay attention, not to the 30 to under 30 crowd, but like the 70 under 70 crowd, which I want to be part of someday. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. It was a pleasure doing the show.
All right. Cheers.
Okay. Yeah. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.com.